Now that I've given you a bit of an overview of the tool, I'd like to begin officially recording, and let me once again welcome everybody to Eyewitness Identification, Unfinished Discussion and Direction for Future Research. This event is sponsored by the National Institute of Justice and the Government Innovators Network. And we'd like to begin, as we do all of our events, with an audience composition poll. So if you would, just click on the option in front of you that you feel best indicates the type of profession. And let me just offer a bit. We're having a couple people who are having trouble with the audio. If you get kicked off of the audio, just go up to the audio menu and click, and in the drop-down menu that comes down, click Listen to Internet Audio Broadcast, and that should get your audio back up. And I'll just wait another second or two for people to select polling options. All right, thank you for participating in that poll. We'll be issuing a couple other polling questions as the event proceeds. So as you see polling slides appear, you can just answer them at your leisure. And without any further ado, let me turn the event over to today's moderator, Superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, Bill Klein.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate it, and good afternoon, and welcome, everyone. What we're going to do today is I'm first going to introduce the three panelists. And as Jim said, I'm Phil Klein. I'm the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department. And with me today are Roy Malpass, Nancy Steble, and James Doyle. Roy is a professor of psychology at the University of Texas, El Paso. He served as a member of the Justice Department's 1999 Task Force on Eyewitness Identification. He has conducted significant research and has published extensively in the area of eyewitness identification and was the leading analyst for the landmark Illinois pilot program on eyewitness identification. Dr. Malpass has been recognized as the foremost expert on eyewitness identification and has been qualified as an expert in courts around the country. Nancy Steble is a professor of psychology at Augsburg College in Minneapolis. Dr. Steble has written extensively on eyewitness identification studies. Dr. Steble assisted in the data analysis of the Hennepin County pilot project, which was funded by NIJ, and also is working with the Tucson Police Department to conduct and analyze a test of double-blinded sequential versus double-blind simultaneous field lineups. And our final panelist is James Doyle, who served as a member of the Justice Department's 1999 Task Force on Eyewitness Identification. He is the author of True Witness, a book which chronicles the efforts of eyewitness science to gain acceptance into the field and the courtroom. Mr. Doyle is a well-known criminal defense attorney who is currently serving as the Director for Modern Forensic Practice at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. So welcome all three, and I think we have a great panel here, and we'll go ahead and start taking questions after I read a short statement. I'm going to ask each of the panelists if they want to read a short statement. Eyewitness identification starts as a police tool to investigate a crime and to get at the truth. The fact that it ends up in a courtroom as an element of our adversarial system, surrounded by a prosecutor, a defense counsel, and ever increasingly an eyewitness expert who is not there but can tell the jury if the eyewitness is wrong or right, does not matter to the police officer in the station who is initially investigating the crime. That officer's allegiance is to the truth. That officer is looking for the culprit, the offender, not just an arrest. I've been in policing over 35 years, and I have never encountered a police officer who knowingly was willing to accept a false identification. Such an officer may exist, but such an officer is neither common, nor does he or she thrive in police circles. All that police want from eyewitness identification is a true and accurate eyewitness identification. That said, law enforcement recognizes that there is room for improvement in eyewitness identification procedures. We can do better at training, better at recording, and better at instructions. And we welcome collaboration and guidance from researchers and, yes, even lawyers, whichever side of the table they sit on. But the problem that practitioners have is that it does not appear to us that the research is either ready for use in the real world or necessarily applicable to real law enforcement. When you read the research carefully, you see that the conclusions are not uniformly supported, that the conclusions are still evolving. And you will see that the methodology may not translate well into the field. And most importantly, you see something being packaged as a science, but it doesn't appear that the packagers are willing to go through the painful process of testing, retesting, and retesting again. As in all science, one test is not enough. 2, 3, and 4 tests are not enough. There is one lesson that the police have learned over the years from the DNA exonerations. It is that any science must be held to a high standard, must pass rigorous field testing, and must be shown to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty. Yet here we are with researchers recommending that we adopt the sequential double-blind identification methods without sufficient scientific testing in the field. And what is of concern is that they are seeking to make it legislation, leaving no room to be wrong, no room to correct any mistakes, and leaving no room for continuing a search for an even better method of eyewitness identification. When Illinois experienced a number of DNA exonerations, nobody was more concerned than law enforcement. We did not have the luxury of debating the issues from afar, of waiting to see how things shook out. We needed to address issues immediately. We needed to immediately get on board with using and expanding DNA and other trusted sciences that can point us to the right person and away from the innocent suspect. So when the advocates of the sequential double-blind identification procedures came to Illinois law enforcement did not turn its back. We questioned the science based on research only, and we should question all science, whether proposed by the so-called experts, the defense, or even the prosecution. But when Illinois law enforcement proposed in response that we conduct a field test, we viewed it as a win-win situation. If this procedure worked well in the field, then it would be a great buy-in for Illinois law enforcement. It would show us how we could apply and adapt the concept to the field. And if this procedure did not work in the pilot study, then we also would want to know that. And a field study could help shed light on issues that still needed to be addressed for future research in this area. So we looked as if furthering the research no matter how it turned out. And we never expected it to be a definitive study. We expected it to be one in a long line of testing, retesting, and retesting a scientific proposition. Illinois law enforcement feels very strongly that the Illinois pilot study was conducted with scientific integrity. It was the first study that had 2 experts independently analyze the data, both of whom came to the same conclusions. There has been much criticism of the comparison of the sequential double-blind lineups to the traditional non-blind lineups. And while I understand the imperfections of that comparison, for law enforcement in the field, it was a necessary comparison. Without a comparison, the assessment of the sequential double-blind lineups would have left us with this question: how does it compare to what we are currently doing? After the Illinois pilot program, Illinois law enforcement was expecting at that point to continue the dialogue as to further research in this area before deciding whether the sequential double-blind procedure was truly a superior method. We expected research not just assessing the sequential double-blind method, but that it would be compared to a variety of lineup procedures, hopefully using modern technology, change policing in many ways since the sequential double-blind procedure was first conceived. Instead, the response to the Illinois study by many, not all, but many of the scientists was to attack the study. There was no intellectual curiosity, but instead many scientists took the position that the study was worthless and that the sequential double-blind procedure should be implemented as a matter of science and law. The scientists appeared intent to return to the days as if the Illinois study was never conducted. I find it hard to believe that the first field study of more than 700 lineups did not teach us something. But the responses made law enforcement believe that perhaps this was not about getting at the truth. Perhaps it was really about a political and ideological agenda. It made us believe that many who are driving the agenda have a vested interest in the outcome, and that the vested interest is not necessarily an allegiance to the truth in eyewitness identifications. It is important for all of us to set aside agendas, to reach across political and ideological positions, to abandon vested interest, and to stop engaging in highly charged and accusatory rhetoric on this issue. It is important that this issue not be approached as if anyone who does not agree with each other is the bad guy. We all have something to bring to the table in the quest for improving eyewitness identification. No one group has the answer. We all have a piece of the puzzle. It is important for all of us to bring our pieces of the puzzle to the table, to work together, and to recognize the police want to do the right thing. We are certainly willing to consider all positions, but we must reach these improvements together, because it is law enforcement who must implement these changes, and if we are not signed on to it, if we do not believe in it, then it is not going to work just because a researcher said that that is. It needs to be proven in the field under a variety of circumstances for us to use it as the tool to get at the truth, which is what we all want. Okay, Roy, do you have an opening statement?
Yeah, I have a couple of things I'd like to mention. I think the single most important problem in approaching the issue is that there is not an established research capacity that is within law enforcement, and that the research and development functions are part of law enforcement's task and not kind of farmed out to the university community. Now, the arrangement that they have in the United Kingdom is actually very interesting because, and it's an accident, as is our criminal justice system, law enforcement system. It's an accident of the way in which the various organizations have developed. In the UK, there is one overarching police force, it's situated in the Home Office. And there are research and development units in the Home Office that are run by and for members of the law enforcement community. That doesn't tend to be the case, at least not in such a broad way in the United States. So we have academic researchers doing work outside of law enforcement, and we have law enforcement that is not well connected with the knowledge generation functions that university researchers perform. So an integration coming together, as we've seen just in the last few years, is a very valuable thing in the United States, and something that I hope we can foster. And so working together on some of these issues is a really important advance. I don't think that at the present time there's any definitive sense that one form of lineup presentation is superior to any other. And there's a number of reasons for this. And lineup presentation methods are not the only things out there that, on the basis of the academic research, one could suggest as improvements in the system. Such things as creating uniformly good lineups is important. There's a technological need there. There are time frames that need to be worried about. There are ways of evaluating adequacy of lineups that need to be developed and administered effectively. And while I can create a really great lineup reliably if you give me a day, that time frame is outside of the demands of most law enforcement agencies. So we have some engineering to do there, and it's best if we can do that in collaboration with a law enforcement environment. I guess I'll stop at that point. I have some other things that I want to say, but in another context, I think. So let's pass it on.
All right. Thanks, Roy. Nancy?
All right. Thank you. What I'd like to do today is just run through 3 or 4 or 5, whatever slides. And not that I'm going to deal with any of these in great depth, but I want to make them available so that if the audience wants to return to them later on, we'll know that they're there and we can attend to them. what I want to do with these slides is just to remind us of the two sources of information that we have at this point: information from the laboratory, information from the field, and of course, as we look to the future, we think about how to bring these together and gain the most information from them. I'm going to begin with the lab, and I know that many of you probably have seen this slide before. Oops, and I can't seem to get to it. There we, whoops. Can I get to the next one? There we go. This is just information from the 2001 meta-analysis, and again, I know a number of you have already read this material, you're familiar with it, but I just want to point out that again, it is available. And this is a summary of what the laboratory research looks like when we compare simultaneous, that is traditional lineup formats, to sequential. In the laboratory, if you look at the results across 30 tests that were available in 2001, you can see that in the laboratory, of course, we know who the perpetrator is, and so we can separate these outcomes in terms of perpetrator present and perpetrator absent. The color blue that you see on your screen, that would be the correct answer for the witness participant. And with the traditional lineup, what we see in the lab is that if the perpetrator is present, there's about a 50% response rate. Hitting the perpetrator, that is, correctly identifying. When the perpetrator is absent, we see that there's about a 51% of subjects who still identify someone. When the perpetrator is absent, that's a very difficult situation for an eyewitness, and of course that's what we're worrying about with our with the DNA exonerations. Those were cases in which the witnesses failed to realize that the perpetrator was not in the lineup. In the next slide, and again, I can't. Oh, there we go. So I think we went too far. Go back one. There we go. This is the sequential lineup. Similarly in the lab, looking with a meta-analysis across all of these 30 tests, and we see that when the perpetrator is present, the identification rate is about 35%, and you'll notice that that's less than in the simultaneous lineup. When the perpetrator is absent, that's when we see the big benefit of the sequential lineup format, in that it seems to inhibit choice. And so for those who prefer not numbers but words, I'm going to just put this very simply in terms of what these studies show, that when you compare traditional simultaneous versus sequential lineups, there we go. The sequential lineup essentially produces a more cautious eyewitness. That is, if we can infer that from the fact that there were fewer identification attempts when there's a sequential lineup. So we think of it as a more conservative test. There are fewer perpetrator identifications, reduce the likelihood of choosing the perpetrator. We also reduce the likelihood of mistaken identifications. And the reduction in mistaken identifications is greater than the reduction in perpetrator identifications. And so I think for the law enforcement community and policymakers, of course, as I suggest here, there's a cost-benefit analysis that has to go on about how are we going to deal with this scenario in which we're really effective at reducing false identifications, but we also lose some of these perpetrator identifications. It's important to note that the research also shows that for those who choose from the lineup, the likelihood of making a correct choice is about twice as great with the sequential versus simultaneous. That's about all I want to say there, other than I should mention, and I think this goes to the point about the base of the research, is Jennifer Dysart, who's at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and I are just completing a meta-analysis, an update to this meta-analysis, which we'll be reporting next week at the John Jay Conference. And I'm not going to say much about that today, other than now we have twice as much research available, about 66 tests to date of comparisons of sequential versus simultaneous lineups in the lab. The new data come from 18 different laboratories, so it's a nice mix. And if you lay the results from this 2001 meta-analysis next to the results from this update, you'll see that they are very, very similar. So we just have a broader base of data to go from. moving from the lab to the field, this is just a couple of things that I think are very important as we consider the future and where we're going. The laboratory, of course, allows us to make recommendations based on what we know about human memory, rigorous controlled testing in which we sort through factors that do or do not affect memory of the eyewitness. The lab provides a variety of stimuli and variations on the procedure. And of course, importantly, the lab provides knowledge of ground truth. We know who the perpetrator is. The field, of course, provides us with a very admirable aspect of research in that it's real practice. We can get a sense of how these lineups actually work in the field. But of course, the drawback is no knowledge of ground truth. So what can we learn together here? I think this is very important as we go forward into the field. We can figure out if the recommendations that come from the laboratory research generalize to the field. And I mean that somewhat in very broad brushstroke way. That is, we can take these procedures to the field and we can see if, wow, was there something we missed as lineup researchers in the lab, something that we didn't anticipate, some factor that we failed to account for, kind of that, gee whiz, what is it that we didn't get right kind of phenomenon. We want to check that. We can also work to find out if it's practical. Can these new procedures work in the field? Can you have the staff and the finances or whatever to make it happen? And finally, we can look at refinements. And I think this is one of the best reasons that I've seen to take this to the field is basically we can get a sense of how might we refine the techniques developed in the lab to better aid the investigation efforts of law enforcement. And we can take some of their questions back to the lab and investigate them further so that we can continue to see these procedures evolve into better and better tools for law enforcement. I'm going to give an example of that in just a moment. A final comment on this particular slide, however, is just that as we go to the future, I think, of course, what people want to see is how do the simultaneous and sequential formats compare, that is, how do they look side by side in the field? And we're hoping to do that, of course, in the future. But I think we also have to be aware of the fact that because we're in the field and without that knowledge of ground truth, we have to be very cautious about proper design and proper interpretation, and that's where I hope we'll work together as practitioners and as scientists. Finally, I wanted to mention that I have these data available from Hennepin County. I'm not going to talk about them now, other than to suggest that if you're interested in how Hennepin County helped to, or how they put together and made these techniques work in the field, we have that information available. We also have some data about how eyewitness performance looks under these new procedures. And finally, moving ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. I guess for some reason we're going backwards. Oh, no, there we go. Eyewitness performance over the repeated sequential lineup. This is when I mentioned how important it is that we work together to see how lineups are done in the field. We can take some of those questions back to the lab. In Hennepin County, we had a question about whether the lineup should be repeated. This is the sequential lineup. What difference would it make in terms of eyewitness accuracy? We collected data not only in the field on what we call laps of the lineup, but also we collected data in an analogous experiment in the lab. And what we found, and many of you are already familiar with this, the fact that once the witness begins to request and begins to look at the lineup more than one time, the error rate climbs in the field, and this information or this outcome was replicated in the lab. In other words, the results converged. So this is just an example, I think, of how important it is that we work together to refine and help the procedures evolve. What can be gained? Very simply, I think what we're all looking for is a standardized, scientifically based procedure that will work for us in the field, in which the eyewitness is required to depend on memory, in which the lineup administrator is conducting and reporting what to all outside sources will be agreeable as an objective appraisal of the lineup interaction and the results, and thereby gaining confidence in the accuracy of eyewitness evidence. And I think that's plenty for me to have said right now. Thank you for your attention, and I guess to the next guest speaker.
Thank you, Nancy. Jim?
Thanks, Jim. I think as the token layperson in the panel today, I'll just take a moment to explain that a meta-analysis is just a statistical technique for combining the results of a whole bunch of studies. So you got a lot more numbers. You feel a lot more confident that the numbers indicate something and aren't just isolated things that have happened in one department or another. And I'd like to just try to give you a moment of history to disentangle some of the stuff where psychology has tried to enter into the legal system. Early on, this goes back 100 years now, it was really just an effort to make people more skeptical about eyewitnesses. And that point of view dominated for close to 75 or 80 years. It was that period where defense lawyers would go to court, defense lawyers would call expert witnesses, and they would try to use them in the courtroom, claiming that what psychologists could do was look back and tell us whether an error had happened sometime in the past. That didn't work very well because at best psychology gives us a kind of statistical answer. It can tell you what happens 8 times out of 10, but it can't tell you whether this case, this witness, this crime is one of the 8 or one of the 2. For the past 30 years or so, psychologists like Professor Malpass, Professor Stablai have been using the psychology in a different way, and that is to try to get it into the investigative stages, because in the investigative stages, then it makes more sense. Then you can try to make the odds a little bit better. If you've got a technique that shows up in the lab to work 8 times out of 10, well, then you've got a good start on thinking that that technique is better than the one that works 3 times out of 10. So there's a lot of stuff from early on that you want to shed and concentrate on this preventive measure. And realize, I think, too, that although you hear very heated arguments on both sides of these questions, you hear people saying that it will be a doom if we have sequential double-blind lineups, it will be a tragedy if we don't. The fact is, all any system can do is enhance the odds. It can make a good outcome more likely, and that's the zone we're working in. I hope we're working today anyway. A couple of things that I think everybody can pretty much agree on is that the days of doing these identification procedures by carrying 6 greasy mugshots around in our pockets are going to end. That the computers are coming. There will be technological advantages here that will make it more convenient for the police, more convenient for witnesses and victims, more convenient for the court people who are trying to review it later. And the question is, how are we going to build these computer programs? How are we going to use them? Everybody, I think, agrees on the things that can go wrong in an eyewitness procedure. Everybody knows that a false hit not only gets the wrong guy, but it lets the right guy go free. And so if you look down the history of exoneration cases, you've got a long list of cases in which there's no villain, there's no police officer trying to put a thumb on the scales, there's no victim trying to frame somebody. What you have is an honest victim and an honest cop ended up getting the wrong guy by using the book that they were using at the time, and in most of those cases the perp goes out and has more victims, while the guy who's wrongfully convicted goes to prison. False hits of suspects are the ones that lead us to the wrong convictions, but there's no reason for anybody to ignore the fact that false misses also result in free perps, that if you radically decrease the number of choices that witnesses are making, you can reach a point where you're never getting the wrong guy, but you're never getting the right guy either. And so that's something that everybody has to keep in mind. Another thing that people outside the criminal justice system tend to forget is that even when you hit a filler in the lineup, and you know that the person who the witness is identified is really somebody from the traffic squad who's standing in, that can hurt a good case. And of course, when you look at the overall impact of these false identification cases, what you've got are cases that come back to haunt you, and you can end up losing the cases you should win because at some point early on you got a conviction in a case where you should have lost. So tightening these things up is to everybody's advantage, and recognizing the limits of the people who are participating in this is also an advantage. The lab studies can't tell you too much about what's really going on in the field, but the field studies are also limited about whether you really know whether you've got the right guy or not. It could be that you have a good rate of suspect identifications, but for all the wrong reasons. If you look at the DNA exoneration cases, what you're really looking at is a list of suspect identifications, most of which, even though everybody was trying to do his best, are cases that turned out to be wrong. And so the field's got its limits, and you know, right now, we know from experience in the field that this double-blind sequential technique can be done. There are states where it's been done for years, in New Jersey and Massachusetts and various other states. People have done this by the thousands. It can be done, but the question is really whether we want to do it or not. And to do that, answer that question, I think you've got to try to avoid the two extremes. There are people on the one hand who would like to just strangle this double-blind sequential thing and end it right here and now. There are other people who would like to legislate it down people's throats, and I don't think either one of those things is going to work. What we have to do is recognize that we're dealing with a very unusual, complex kind of trace evidence here, that this eyewitness evidence, like physical evidence you find on a crime scene, it's difficult to recover, it's easy to contaminate, it's very hard to handle, and cooperation is important, but, you know, I think the cooperation is going to require more than a kind of civil conversation later. It's going to require people involving scientists in field studies and scientists who will listen to the practitioners tell them what the barriers are in the field. A lot of things that have to happen in the field to make the scientists be in a position to figure out what really did happen. And there are all kinds of things that we can talk about later. I think the questions and answers are the better way to go about it. But my hope is that we can steer between the two alternatives you see at the top of my list here and try to talk a little bit about how would we go forward now, do real field studies that really take account of both the science of witness reliability and the challenges of police operations. I guess I'll stop there.
Okay, James, thank you. At this point, we'll go to our questions. Okay, this is from Greg Marcantel, and I'll throw it out to all three, and whoever wants to answer it, or if all of you want to make a comment on it. Do you think that the meta-analysis that seems to underpin the current trend regarding the superiority of the sequential over simultaneous methods of lineup is based in Daubert quality science?
I suppose I can start. This is my meta-analysis, along with my colleagues. Absolutely. You know, sometimes you hear the studies in psychology in this eyewitness area referred to as classroom studies or whatever, and that's, I think, kind of disparaging. I've never conducted a study in a classroom, and I don't think most of my colleagues do. These are really high-quality, scientifically sound studies conducted in laboratories with good controlled conditions, and in the meta-analysis, I include both published and unpublished research, but of course we all recognize that published research that's been peer-reviewed is likely of higher quality, and we certainly have more confidence in it. I should mention in the meta-analysis we separate those out to see what difference it makes, of course. But yeah, I think the lab data are very compelling. They're high quality. They're done by completed by very good scientists. And as I've watched the data grow over the years, first putting it together in 2001, and now putting it together again in 2007. I like I say, I think it's very compelling. Are there things we don't know? Sure, but there are core patterns of eyewitness behavior that show up over and over and over and over and over in the lab, and you just simply can't ignore that fact.
Let me just mention a little something about this, because it gives me an opportunity to draw the distinction again between courtroom admissibility questions and field reliability questions. In the Daubert opinion, if you look at it carefully, Daubert develops its definition of science and what is good science by looking at a Third Circuit case called Downing versus United States. And in fact, the whole idea of science that is in Daubert is borrowed from Downing. Downing is a case in which the Third Circuit upholds the admission of expert testimony and eyewitness identification based on experimental psychology. But although the definition in Daubert fits this kind of science like a glove, that doesn't mean that everybody who practices good science in the field of experimental psychology has to come to the same conclusions. The Daubert question is simply whether there's a common language out there that everyone agrees to, about what is good science and what isn't. And when that is generally accepted, then it meets the Dalbert test. So, for example, there are disagreements between Dr. Stablai and Dr. Malpass. But when they talk about those disagreements, they're both talking about experimental psychology. The fact that the basic method is admissible doesn't mean that the two experts have to agree. And conversely, the fact that two experts disagree doesn't mean that there's not general acceptance about the method. But again, we don't want to shortchange this debate, I don't think, by talking purely about the courtroom. We want to think a little bit more about policy decisions that never get to the courtroom and whether we can make use of information by having a conversation rather than the usual adversary slugfest.
Hey, Roy, any comment?
Yes, I couldn't disagree more with Nancy Stablai about this. The problem is that, first of all, there are some methodological things that have been missed in research on this topic. A large number of the studies missed, for example, counterbalancing the presentation order of the faces, or randomizing them, and instead had a preference for particular positions. It turns out that if you add in the meta-analysis a moderator and analyze the effects of that, when you look only at the counterbalance studies, which are the appropriate methodology, for correct identifications, simultaneous yields more correct identifications than sequential, and for false identifications, sequential yields more than simultaneous. Now, the problem of interpreting that and moving that into policy, or moving any of this stuff into policy, has to do with the cost-benefit analysis, which Nancy Stablai mentioned earlier, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But I want to note some other things about the body of literature, because Mr. Markentel's question is about the quality of the literature. For example, with respect to the similarity of the perpetrator or the suspect in these studies, which affects identification rates, 26% of the published studies didn't report any information about that. With respect to the filler selection for these lineups, 44% of the published studies selected them with no empirical checks or no pilot testing. With respect to stimulus sampling, 88% of the published studies only used one target face. So there's no opportunity to see what happens if you use a variety of faces in these studies. With respect to position effects in the lineup, 68% of the published studies did not report using counterbalancing methods. And only 24% of the published studies reported using any manipulation check on the success of the lineup construction or presenting a fair lineup. So there are some serious difficulties with the literature. And with respect to whether these are of Dalbert quality, well, I think we ought to be focusing on the published studies and not the unpublished studies, because we don't know, in many cases, we don't know, we have fundamental things about the unpublished studies that we don't know and can't even find out. With respect to the cost-benefit analysis question, there is a paper that I published in Psychology, Public Policy, and Law this year, or last year, that goes over the question of a policy analysis very carefully. The judgment of superiority of a particular form of lineup has to be based on assumptions about the relative values placed on the outcomes of the identification procedures. And these assumptions make a big difference in the preference for a lineup form. I mean, do you value correct identifications as positively as you value false identifications? Are false identifications more disruptive to our system or less? Those are decisions that have to be made not in the science, but in the societal review of how we stand on which kind of mistake is preferable to another kind of mistake. And the assumptions about the probabilities of these same ID outcomes are important indeed. Now, this brings us to the problem of a meta-analysis. The meta-analysis is actually a dull instrument for analyzing the question because meta-analysis is a victim of the nature of the existing literature. Effects in relationships that haven't been studied can't be represented in a meta-analysis. For example, none of the studies in the meta-analysis contain a blind or not blind comparison. If the distribution of studies across important variables is skewed, or if important variables haven't been studied, then a meta-analysis won't be able to provide information about the empty spaces in our knowledge. For example, in the existing literature, there are perhaps 2 studies that have examined features packaged with sequential lineups in the simultaneous lineups as well. For example, it's possible to ask an identification question for each face in a simultaneous lineup, but that method has never been used. So we don't know which part of the sequential lineup, asking 6 questions about individual faces, implying that there are many faces more than the 6 of interest, just to take those 2 for example, those are always paired with sequential lineups, and they've never been investigated when you pair them with simultaneous lineups. Work in our lab indicates that those other 2 variables may very well account for what passes for the sequential superiority effect. But that's never been torn apart to be examined specifically. So we don't know what the active ingredient is in the existing sequential lineups because nobody has studied it. And because nobody has studied it, it doesn't appear in a meta-analysis, and you can't get information out of a meta-analysis about that particular issue. Here is a series of citations for some of the studies that bear on this. You can get to my webpage and see, you can get information about a variety of these things. And the McQuiston, Surratt, Malpass, and Trudeau 2006 study is our review of the methods, data, and theory on sequential and simultaneous lineups, and the Malpass 2006 study is a fairly extensive policy evaluation of the 2 lineup forms. So,
let me just take a moment to, I think this is obviously a hot topic in psychology, the question of sequential versus simultaneous, but let me make a couple of points about this if I can. The first is the conversation you just heard Dr. Malpass have was about a generally accepted area of methodology. In other words, there's a disagreement between Dr. Malpass and Dr. Stablai, but that doesn't mean that it's inadmissible in court. It may mean that there would have to be a battle of the experts that was time-consuming and that a judge might decide in his or her discretion to leave out, but it doesn't mean that it can't come in. But I'd hate to have us focusing on the battle to indicate that anything having to do with psychology and practice is futile, because there are a long list of things that psychologists would agree not only on the general method, but also, I think, on the conclusions. Things about the usefulness of pre-lineup instructions to witnesses, telling witnesses that the real perpetrator may or may not be in the lineup is, I think, very generally regarded as a good practice. There are ways to select good fillers for a lineup, and there are bad ways to select fillers for a lineup. Psychology has a pretty good sense of agreement about how you would go about that. There are things like getting an immediate measure of a witness's confidence at the time that the witness makes an identification is also something that's generally regarded as a good thing to do, a best practice, where there is not broad disagreement among psychologists about it. So the problem for practitioners is that practitioners are going to have to go out and do this. Practitioners, unfortunately, can't wait for the research to be perfected, either to prove categorically that simultaneous is always better or sequential is always better. What we have to do is look at what we have and engage, I think, in an ongoing conversation with the psychologists where we are careful not to listen to just one psychologist, but where we're also careful to be active consumers of this information and try to find out exactly where the problems lie and exactly what we should be doing from now on. This disagreement focused on this particular issue could obscure all sorts of things that we could start doing tomorrow, where I think people would generally regard it as a productive and positive step forward, utilizing science to prevent misidentifications.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, Jim. The things that you mentioned, lineup instructions, creation of or development of lineups to selection of fillers, those are things that we could work on today to begin improvements, and I don't think they're particularly controversial. So I certainly agree on that. On the business of the conditions under which simultaneous or sequential lineups are preferable, it turns out that one of the things that is important in determining the value or the utility of the policy utility of a simultaneous or sequential lineup is the probability that the suspect is actually in the lineup. And that puts us in a difficult position because we don't know that beforehand unless we use extrinsic evidence as a guide to which technique to use. And I'm not even certain that would be an appropriate kind of a procedure. So,
but on the other hand, that's not really, I don't think, an argument for throwing up our hands and doing nothing. I think it is an argument for working with the police practitioners in the field to see if there's a way where, since we know the technology is emerging and in some way is going to take over, to use technology to study the questions that are on people's minds. Specifically, I know that there are several departments now who are interested in running on laptop computers very careful, limited tests of whether sequential or simultaneous procedures work better, to be able to do it in a way that randomly assigns which case will be simultaneous and which will be sequential, to make sure that the witness is making the witness's own choices, to make sure that everything is documented and that everything is recorded. And if several departments do this in the same way, we might be able to get relatively quickly to some numbers that will at least give a practitioner's answer, or at least give the practitioners something to work with in making the policy decisions, because the policy decisions aren't going to go away. We can't assume that sequential is better, but on the other hand, we can't assume that the simultaneous is better either. I think the advent of this technology, which we're all going to use, I think I just can't see an argument that people are going to prefer to drag witnesses out of their houses to the station to doing it remotely on a computer or at least preliminarily. It's quicker. You've got better access to databases of mugshots and that kind of thing. So I think we're going to have to choose, and we're going to have to put ourselves in the best position we can to choose, and to recognize that neither of these things is going to be a silver bullet. One or the other might help the odds a little.
Well, I certainly agree with that, and I certainly agree that those studies that you mentioned are important things to do at this point in time. Yeah.
I wonder if I might add something, and I guess this gets to the issue of interpretation, and it really is support of what both of you have said. And that is the fact that, I've certainly read Dr. Malpass's work, and I agree with a number of the issues that he's brought up about, the lack of complete reporting in our articles or whatever, which I think is really just a function of how much you can put in an article and a lack of recognition of what's important to the audience. You find you go back to the researchers and say, well, how did you do this or that, and they'll give you the answer. But there are some questions that, as Dr. Malpass mentioned, we haven't investigated perhaps as thoroughly as we should. Those missing pieces or those things not studied, I think I see those in a different way than Dr. Malpass does. And that is, I think that the basic superiority or let's just not even use that word, the basic findings about the simultaneous and the sequential lineup as represented in this meta-analysis, they're really quite robust. And like I said, there's a really quite compelling, solid literature that suggests that these differences really exist. Those missing pieces, sometimes when I hear Dr. Malpass, it sounds like with those missing pieces, the general tenor is if we only had those missing pieces, boy, then we'd know we'd not be doing sequential anymore. And I don't see it that way at all. I think those missing pieces are kind of on the periphery. In other words, those are things we should investigate, but because of the fact that they may help us make revisions that will sharpen our theoretical understanding about these different lineup formats and sharpen our recommendations to practice, I don't think it's, those are the kinds of things that are going to reverse the whole thing or cause all of us to hit the brakes. And so I just don't see them as quite as significant, perhaps. I think they may be in fact, more important in a theoretical basis. They're the kinds of questions that, as theoretically we want to look at. We want to help us to understand the operation of sequential and simultaneous lineups. But in terms of practice, sometimes I think the good news is practice kind of outruns the laboratory research, and again, I think one example, I can give you a couple examples. One is the one I mentioned already in Hennepin County and other jurisdictions in which the police had been wanting to do multiple laps in the sequential lineup. They came to the researchers and said, "What do you know about this?" And we said, "We don't know. That's a missing piece. We don't know what's going to happen in that second, third, or fourth lap." And so the reaction there is not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but to say, let's test this revision and see what difference it makes. The issue of, whether you stop the sequential lineup midway with an ID, if the witness says at number 2, that's it, should the lineup stop or should it continue to the end? That's a question that we perhaps haven't answered successfully in the lab, but on the other hand, I think the field has kind of run past that and made decisions about what they want to do for various practical reasons. And in the lab, it'd be nice if we could follow up and find out if that really makes a difference, whether you continue to the end or you stop at an ID. But in the meantime, I don't think our lack of knowing the answer to that question should diminish our lineup reform efforts in moving forward and in doing what we know to be best practice at this point.
Yeah, but best practice is not a very good guide. Best practice does not contain within it a critical aspect to it. Best practices is a snapshot of what we know at a particular moment, but it's not forward-looking. It doesn't ask, well, what don't we know? Let me give you an example. We have a move on to replace wholesale simultaneous lineups with sequential lineups. But what would happen if we took the existing simultaneous lineups and when they're administered, we ask the witness to look at number 3 and ask them the same question you would ask in a sequential lineup: is this the person or is this the offender? And record their answer and then go on to another one and say, look at number 5, is this the offender? And do that in a random order across lineups for each member of the lineup. Now they're all sitting there. You're just directing the person's attention to different members of the lineup. Does that work as well as a sequentially presented lineup in terms of retaining, for example, correct IDs while reducing false identifications? Well, the fact is that in the research on sequential versus simultaneous lineups, all the development, all the tinkering with process, all the, okay, let's add this, let's do this instead, that's all been applied to sequential lineups with a static, traditional simultaneous lineup as the foil. No development activity has been directed at simultaneous lineups. So let's give them equal time. Let's tinker with simultaneous lineups. Let's add features that seem to work with or are associated uniquely with sequential lineups, and see if adding those features brings the improvement to simultaneous lineups that you observe sometimes with sequential lineups. That research hasn't been done, and that's not a trivial question. So how can we say that sequential lineups are generally superior if research on ways to improve simultaneous lineups hasn't been done and can't therefore be reported in the meta-analysis?
Well, yeah.
You know what? We got a lot of questions here. I'm gonna move on a little bit. Let me go on to the next question and throw it out. Okay, this is from Ebson. Do we know what we all mean by sequential? Aren't there many different ways to do sequential? Isn't it silly to act as if there is just one procedure here? A key issue that Roy mentioned and about which we know little is the effective position in the sequence on accuracy rates. We also do not know how lineup similarity structure interacts with position. Aren't these important issues to resolve? And I'll throw that to any one of the three to answer.
Yeah, I think I have the same answer to Dr. Ebison as I gave to to Dr. Malpass, and that is that you can conjure up a lot of hypotheticals about, well, what about this factor and what about that factor and what about if we fix the simultaneous in a different way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And those are all good areas of future research. But in the meantime, we have this comparison of a simultaneous lineup that, quite frankly, I think if we look at the DNA exoneration cases, we say, this is not working as we intended. Isn't there a better way? And I think what the researchers have given law enforcement at this point is an idea that this sequential procedure that has been developed, even with its number of unknowns or ways in which we can tinker and perhaps make it better, is better than the traditional simultaneous lineup. But I think that's where we are. And the fact of not changing to some new type of lineup format or new type of lineup procedure, that's a decision in itself, a decision to stick with what we've used in the past, which, quite frankly, I don't think has worked for us very well. Maybe another way to think about this is if we had all along been using sequential lineups and someone came forward right now and said, look at this meta-analysis. It tells us that we should do these simultaneously. We should let the eyewitness compare pictures, and then we'd get a higher target present hit rate, and we'd get some false identifications along the way. But I think we'd be hard pressed to say, well, that's a good idea. So I just see that while there are a lot of good ideas for future research and ways to tinker, we have to make a decision for the benefit of essentially reducing the risk of false identifications that we've seen through the DNA exonerations.
Well,
and I think another point to make about this is whichever course or practice people use now, putting aside for the moment which they should choose, it's very important to find a way to have science participating in that so that we're documenting the field experience with either simultaneous or sequential so that we know what is happening and we can make decisions better later on. The difficulty from the practitioner's point of view is that you're going to have to do one of them. And that right now, looming over us, I think, are going to be choices about what are we going to put on our computers, how are we going to do this on the computer, and we can't really start from the position that we've got a status quo. In terms of doing things for software, we don't have a status quo, and that's why I think really the most productive development that I've heard of is these departments who are trying to cooperate now with scientifically based field tests on the laptops with scientific participation from the beginning. I know that both Dr. Stablai and Dr. Malpass were able to agree that the particular method being proposed for these departments is a productive way to go about it, even though neither of them will agree with the other right now about what's the current state of things and what should we do right now. But we do have a way forward here where police officers and detectives and policymakers can take an active role in gathering the information and making sure that it's an ongoing conversation so that when new developments come up, new information comes up in the lab, things not yet studied or later studied, there's a way to integrate that into our processes. One of the things that people hear John Jay preach about police departments, where John Jay's got a lot of experience in that, is that they ought to be learning organizations, and that you really want to just not go out and do a study and live with it for the next 30 years until it blows up in your face, but you want to create a culture where you're constantly learning, you're constantly studying, you're constantly taking a critical look at what you're doing. I think these new studies that are on the horizon are a good example of that. But I think they're a particularly good example because what they're going to do is bring everybody to the table, to bring the researchers to the table, bring the police to the table, make everybody talk about it together, even let the lawyers into it a little bit in the background, although I have to confess that in my experience, lawyers haven't been very helpful with this issue.
Okay, I'm going to go again, and let's take another question. This one's going to be from Daniel Scullett. Were the lineups in the lab for real cases with real consequences from the identification?
From real cases, no.
Okay,
No.
I think that answers that. And then we'll move on to the next question. And this one is from M. Waymeyers. Do your studies on simultaneous and sequential identifications work in the field? Photo arrays or show-ups with the person? Anybody want to jump in?
Well, Phil, if I could I just go back to the last question, because I think we've got to steer clear of the idea that we're going to find one of these areas to be categorically better than the other. It's true that the lab people don't know whether there are real consequences, but the other side of the coin is they do know who the real perpetrator is. When you stage a mock crime, you know who really did it. That's a problem that you don't really know in the field unless you've been able to gather the resources to do a very complex analysis of does DNA back this up? Is there a confession that backs this up? And so both of these ways of studying this have disadvantages. The lab has the disadvantage of not being in real-world conditions in some respects. The field has the disadvantage of not really knowing what the lab can know, which is who's the actual perpetrator. And I think one of the things that was a surprise to me as a practitioner was that it doesn't seem as though human memory works very differently in different settings, that memory kind of works like memory. And so there is a way to generalize from the lab to the field and the field to the lab. These aren't two completely different worlds when it comes to memory.
Yeah, let me see if I can jump onto that as well. I have a slide on mine. Here it is. It's a diagram of the ways in which laboratory studies and field studies can be compared. And in order to compare them, you have to move to the level, a fairly coarse level, of analysis of the field studies. So if you take the correct IDs and the false IDs from the laboratory and merge them, they become the suspect IDs for the field studies. And do the same thing with the filler IDs when the suspect is the perp and when the suspect isn't the perp. And also for the no IDs. And you get three figures that you can use, or three statistics that you can use to compare the lab and the field. And when you do this using the first meta-analysis from Steble and her colleagues, you find that you get the same pattern of results. So at the level at which you can compare them, laboratory studies and field studies actually give the same pattern of findings. Now, what you don't know is how to go the other way. How do you unpackage the suspect IDs in field studies and allocate some proportion of those IDs to correct IDs and to false IDs? Well, you have to have some assumptions, or you have to do the things that Jim just talked about. You have to go back and do what Bruce Behrman has done in a couple of studies now, and use the case records to make probability estimates that a particular case, in a particular case, the suspect was actually the perp. Now, that can be done. It's expensive, but that's part of the process of finding out ground truth in field studies. It can be done, and it should be done to the degree that it's possible, because that's the way we will really find out what works and what doesn't. If we stay at the level of suspect IDs, we can argue about it all day, and we won't really have an answer.
And I think, Roy, I don't know, I'd be interested to hear whether you agree with me about this, but that puts a premium on doing what we do in a documented way so that people do have something agreed to look at. And I think that's one of the positives of doing a good number of these laptop-based studies that will record the information and give us a good starting point to go back to.
It'll give us a good starting point, but then we need to have access to the case files that we haven't had access to in the past,
right.
And
but among other things, these
of going through.
All right, I'm gonna jump in with some more questions because we got a lot here.
Okay.
This is from Greg Marcantel. While I'm employed with a larger agency, the state of New Mexico is primarily composed of small law enforcement agencies. How would you address the blind administrator issue for very small police departments in my state?
Maybe I can jump in there based on what we found in Hennepin County. In that study, we looked at a variety of size of 4 different police departments, some from Minneapolis, obviously a very large jurisdiction, some from very small towns. And actually the small towns did not have difficulty coming up with creative ways in which to address the blind administration. I think there was some anticipation that we're going to be short of staff or this or that, but there are ways around this, and so I would recommend reading the Hennepin County report for their idea of creative ways to address this, as well as other jurisdictions that have used what we call the folder technique. Obviously, Jim Doyle has talked a great deal about use of computers or whatever, but there are ways both high tech and low tech to deal with the situations where you think that the blind administrator is going to be an obstacle to making these changes.
The experience of departments that have done it seems to be that they can do it, but you always have to remember that, as Roy pointed out, we don't have one unified set of police procedures here. For example, in New York, live lineups are much more frequent than they are anyplace else. So anyone coming in and proposing any program needs to sit down with the police, get everybody to the table all at once, and see if there's a way to work out the problems. And that's why, from my point of view, the process of getting everybody to sit down and work these things through together is of more interest to me, anyway, than any particular outcome of what particular technique is used. But I do know that in Massachusetts and in New Jersey, and where there are departments of all different sizes and where thousands of these things have been done now in the last few years, people have found a way to work around the problems. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be jurisdictions where local internal administrative rules, court rules, extreme resource situations might create a different answer. But, I realize I'm sounding like I'm a one-trick pony here, but it's one of the reasons I'd like the technology to be looked into, is so that these things can be done in ways that work for the practitioners and reflect the best of the science, and at the same time document things so that if science needs to critique what's being done, needs to move on from it, we've got the raw material to do that.
Okay, I'm going to jump in. This question is directed to Roy or Nancy. It's from Paul Carroll. Why are the results from the Hennepin County study so different from Illinois? Roy, you want to go first?
No, I'll pass that on to Nancy.
All right, Nancy.
All righty. Well, first of all, the 2 studies, the Illinois and the Minneapolis study, the Hennepin County, they had very different purposes. And I'll let Roy talk about the Illinois study, but in Hennepin County, the Hennepin County attorney had already been convinced by the laboratory findings that double-blind sequential was the way to go. She wanted to create greater confidence in the lineup eyewitness evidence, and so she was just convinced. And so in Hennepin County, they switched in these 4 cities for the pilot to all double-blind sequential. So there was no attempt to make a comparison between the new and the old. It was just, okay, let's see if we can make this work in the field. The emphasis really was on the issue of the previous caller about practicality. Can we make this work for real field investigations? And at the same time, I was called in to collect a lot of data so that we would have a quantitative picture, if you will, about what happened there. But again, there was no intent to do a scientific comparison between the new and the old. And the Chicago study, as I think you know, was predicated on the idea that there would be a comparison.
Nancy, wasn't it the case that when you look at the data for sequential lineups for Hennepin County and Illinois, that overall the results were extremely similar?
Yeah, they were very similar, and when I first looked at that, I was surprised that they were. We in Hennepin County, the results looked a little bit different at first blush, simply because of the fact that we had included both familiar perpetrators, that is familiar to the witness, and strangers, and that of course elevated suspect identifications a little bit. But when we kind of parsed that out, and I think Roy did the same thing, we realized that for the blind sequential, that yes, the numbers were very similar.
Okay, next one is going to be from M. Waymeyer. It says, your experts are not answering the basic question by people who really do work in the field. Please define the procedure for a field application of your double-blind sequential versus simultaneous identification procedure. And he adds that we have a room full of prosecutors who are waiting to hear an answer.
Well, one thing to do would be to look at, there's a resource page as part of the web conference function here. And the Suffolk County District Attorney's protocol for how to do double-blind sequential is linked on that page. It has a number of elements, but most of the places that have gone to it will make available to the prosecutors, certainly, the protocols that they use. I know that aside from the Suffolk County one that's on the list, New Jersey and Wisconsin also make their general protocols very broadly available. So the how-to is out there, and there are people in those offices who will be happy to talk to you about how it works in real life.
I wonder if, is the question, just in a simple, maybe just demands just even a simple answer of what are the central components. And for Hennepin County, they were that there would be 6-member lineups with just one suspect, 5 fillers chosen to match the witness's description of the perpetrator. The second component was the cautionary instruction to the witness that the perpetrator may or may not be in the lineup. The third component was to take a statement of the witness's confidence in the witness's own words recorded at the time of the identification before any possible feedback. The blind administration was that the lineup administrator did not know who the suspect was, and the witness was instructed that the administrator did not know who the suspect in the lineup was. And then the sequential presentation was simply that the photos were presented one at a time. There was no, the witness could not compare photos side by side at any time, and the full sequence was completed even if an early identification was made, and the witness was informed that this completion was required by the procedure. Does that help at all?
Okay, hopefully. And I'm going to go to the next questions from Jack Petrone. Not being a scientist, perhaps I do not understand the science involved. Dr. Malpass has pointed to a number of questions about meta-studies. Is the theory of the meta-study that if you study enough studies, the possible problems he cites are less likely to be a problem? And second, if these are problems about lineups, is there any reason to believe that actual lineups are being conducted in the field are not subject to the same infirmities? Dr. Malpass, you want to take that?
Oh, well, I mean, I would be surprised if people thought that meta-analyses are not restricted in what they can say to the set of studies that is contained in the meta-analysis. So if there is some kind of a quirk in the underlying literature that there are no studies that represent particular questions or that have investigated particular questions, then those questions can't be analyzed in the meta-analysis. So that was the point that I was trying to make, is that there are many things that haven't been studied, and so and we do know or could know in advance that they should have been looked at. So they can't be represented in a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis as a fine technique for doing what it's intended to do, and that is to examine things within a body of literature. But if in that body of literature things about the studies have not been discussed or have not been measured or are not reported, then those two, it's difficult to use them as what we call moderator analyses, moderator variables in the meta-analysis. So but the meta-analysis is a great technique for summarizing a literature. I mean, I really am not the expert on that, and in this panel, Nancy Sebley is. She's done many of them on important topics in this field. So maybe you ought to respond to that.
Yeah, well, I agree with what you said, Roy. The purpose of a meta-analysis is simply to take all of the studies that have tested the same hypothesis. In this case, that the differences or similarities between sequential and simultaneous, and pull it all together to, in fact, see if in that data across all those studies there's a reliable pattern that shows up over and over and over and over. Just a real stubborn pattern that you say, okay, it's there. We can't deny it. And but Roy is exactly right that if there's some variable that has not been studied by any of the studies within the meta-analysis, then it's of course not going to be showing up in the summary statement. I think that if I understood the caller, I think there was a very perceptive comment too about the kinds of omissions that we see in the lab. About the sequential lineups, that would those also not be omissions in the field in terms of actual practice? And I think that's a very good point.
Okay, let me go to our next question. Thomas Westfall. As an investigator, am I faced with the problem if I use simultaneous or sequential methods? I am faced with a case that must prove one method and then disprove the other method, aren't I? How close are we to having an empirical view of eyewitness reliability? Despite science field practitioners are faced with and must deal with court circuits that may be different from judge to judge and from county to county. Is there going to be a solution sometime, or is this a never-ending question?
Well, on the never-ending question of things, one of the problems we face, and that I fear actually, is that we're going to have to do the old Gilda Radner thing. If we're not sure about what we're doing in the first place, and it doesn't survive transpositions to various departments of various sizes and kinds, I fear that we're going to have to say at some point, oh, never mind. I mean, new stuff has come up, and we now have to change our procedures. They do that actually very, very well in the medical field. I mean, changes of procedure on things like prostate exams and mammograms have happened in the last 4 or 5 years based on new evidence that's come in. But I'm not sure we could be that quick to respond in the law enforcement area, and I'm not sure that law enforcement would be tolerant of procedural changes based on new evidence coming in. It's one of the problems that we need to settle in the kind of administrative arena.
Okay, here's a question from Jay Mayo. What is your thoughts on a witness who identifies a suspect from any lineup but gives you a percentage after identifying him or her, stating that I'm 80% sure that's him? How much confidence can you put with a witness who gives you a percentage opposed to a person who says, yes, that is him?
Oh, that's a tough question. I don't know that. I don't know that I have an answer to that. Roy, anything?
Well, it certainly is less than 100%.
Well, one of the things that I think, someone correct me if I'm wrong about this, there's general agreement about is that it is important to make a note of that. Because what tends to happen to witnesses is, although they'll say 80% at the time of, say, the photo array, they could later say 100% or 40% or 20%. And it's important for us to know that the confidence level is moving because the court system tends to rely very heavily on confidence in looking at a witness and judging whether the witness is right or wrong. And it looks very much as though witnesses' confidence can be boosted pretty easily by ordinary routines in the regular adversary process, not anybody trying to contaminate things, but things change. And so to get that snapshot at the moment of the identification is a worthwhile thing to do. And most of the standard modern protocols from departments who have looked at it will say that that's a good thing to do. Now, you're still going to have an argument later about whether 80% is beyond a reasonable doubt, or whether that's pretty sure that's the guy who's really 80% or 70%. But it's an important thing to make a note of, to know whether what the witness's own sense of confidence is at the time.
And James, as long as you're on, I'll give you this next one because it's directed towards defense attorney. This is from Michael Shapiro. Will the protocols also be made available to defense attorneys or only prosecutors?
I would think that most prosecutors would consider these public documents that they would want everyone to know about. When people have these protocols, it's really in order to inspire some confidence in the system, to see that the investigative routines are being followed and that nobody's making this up as they go along. So generally speaking, what a police department will try to do is develop the best set of procedures that it can. They end up with a set of procedures that they can live with. They're not trying to keep it secret. And the good thing is that they all keep working on it. I hope. I'm more confident than Roy in law enforcement's ability to take in new information and change. I mean, the argument about whether we should change things or not, again, is going to depend on new information that comes out.
Oh, I think law enforcement is quite capable of doing that. My earlier comment, I hope I didn't leave the wrong impression, is that law enforcement in the United States is not set up in a way that really promotes that. We will have to work on it, but I don't think there's anything that hinders law enforcement learning and developing procedures. But it's going to be spotty across the 6,000 in some jurisdictions across the country.
Well, I think it's certainly fair to say that there'll be some places that lag and some places that lead. But today's event, with a very solid law enforcement attendance, I think indicates that law enforcement has. Let me put it this way. I think it's less true now than it might have been 15 years ago. I think people in law enforcement around the country are eagerly seeking out what's new in a department. I think that Phil Klein knows what's new in Ray Kelly's department, and he knows what's new in Bill Bratton's department, and everyone is really working hard at all the levels to try to get this information around. It's true we don't have a home office that issues a memo to everyone and says, do this. But I think the lag is a lot shorter than it used to be.
Okay, this kind of segues into the next question from Greg Marcantel. I am also contemplating a best practice emphasis on physical lineup methods from the legislature. Is there compelling evidence in your studies that would suggest that physical lineup methods are superior to photographic lineup methods?
I think the current evidence on that is that there's very little difference, if any. Jim or Nancy, do you want to?
Yeah, I agree with that. That I think in terms of what I've looked at, most of the studies I think you may be aware is certainly have been done with photo lineups. There have been a few with live lineups, but they've not shown any difference. And I wonder if you might kind of take this back to the issue of what we've been investigating all along. Of course, is human memory, and so any time that we try and establish whether it's this line of procedure better or that line of procedure, of course, we're trying to pull it back to human memory, peeling away all the outside influences on memory that might exist. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we move forward. If there are issues related to physical lineups that make human memory different, I guess I'm not aware of what those might be.
Well, certainly physical lineups give you more information at the recognition stage because there's just simply more information about the person. But there may be a difference between the person at that stage and at the encoding stage or at the time of the original event. And my guess is that the limitation on the process happens with encoding for memory at the original event. That's where the limitations on the process occur.
Mm-hmm.
So you mess around with different kinds of lineups at the other end of the process, and you have more information there, but you can't make use of it because there wasn't sufficient information in the beginning.
Yeah, that's a good point. Otherwise stated, all these changes, we can't make the memory of the eyewitness better at the time that we present a lineup of any sort. We the memory is the memory. We can't make it better at that point. All we can do is try and shave away, like I say, all these aspects or intrusions that might come from external sources, and I think that's what we've been trying to do, is to figure out how can we get closer and closer and closer to the witness's memory as it exists.
Okay, which is going to bring me right into Gary Martin's question. In a sequential photo lineup, blind or not, how would you handle the witness asking for repeated views of a particular photo? Would you go through the entire sequence as originally conducted? And would you limit the amount of times the photo sequence could be viewed? Would the likelihood of filler identification go up after the original sequencing?
Yes, I don't think we've ever tried to or suggested that we should limit the amount of time spent with a particular photo. We do worry about repeating a single photo or the entire lineup. What I've been recommending is that if you're going to repeat, if the witness wants to see them again, repeat the entire lineup again. And what we've seen, as I mentioned really right at the beginning of this broadcast, is that as soon as you start repeating the lineup, you're going through it another lap, the filler rate grows. So it suggests that perhaps some relative judgment or something is kicking in there that you have to take into account in the recording process, so that later people who are making judgment about the veracity of that identification can take that into account.
This is a very good question, and it, I think, identifies another area in which more research is needed. I mean, Pizzullo and her colleagues in Canada have been working with children on something called the elimination lineup, where you ask who's the best person in the lineup, and then you ask, yeah, okay, that may be the best, but is that the person? That's an interesting question, and it might very well apply to Mr. Martin's question here. Partially, the issue is, what exact question do you direct at the witness and at what point in the process? These are things that need more study because they haven't been fleshed out really well yet.
Okay, I'm going to go to Paul Carroll with a question. One of the main problems I find around the country is that most officers have no formal training regarding eyewitness evidence, and most departments have no written policy regarding eyewitness procedures, Chicago being an exception. Paul, thank you for pointing that out. Would it be best to first consider some formal training and written procedures in police departments?
Well, we're moving towards that to some extent in El Paso. Some El Paso PhD students have worked with the police academy here and developed training modules. But I take your point, Paul, that this is a national issue, and certainly training is a good thing. I mean, as I talk to police administrators about all kinds of problems, the first answer I usually get is, well, that's a training issue. Well, this is a training issue too.
I think one of the things that people are beginning to realize is that you have a kind of CSI issue here, but that the trace evidence here isn't like blood or semen that you find on a crime scene. It's the witness's memory. And more departments are beginning to recognize that they have to take as careful an approach to this memory trace evidence as they do to the kind of crime scene things. It may be lagging a little, but I think people are working to catch up. The sooner they catch up, the better.
Okay, we're going to start wrapping this up. I got another question from Greg Marcantel. Based on your points, we can only impact the retrieval stage of memory. Regarding this position, would it therefore be advantageous to conduct a cognitive interview before lineup presentation, or do you see this process as a potential biasing argument as well?
I think that's very tricky. because you have to be careful that you don't, in fact, give any information or feedback to the witness about any of the events that come from the police investigation. If you can do that, well, I like with a lot of other things, I think that needs to start with some research about how you actually implement the technique. Years ago, I did some research in which we found that what we called then a guided memory interview, where we actually used some priming, given non-controversial aspects of the physical environment of the witnessing. We found that after a 5-month delay, we could improve identification by 20%. But there's been very little research done on that particular problem since that time, although I think it's probably a promising area of inquiry.
Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask James, Nancy, and Roy to kind of give us their thoughts. James, we'll start with you, and we'll wrap it up. You can give me about 2 minutes.
Well, I think today's been a good example of the kind of conversation that people can have, but I have to emphasize again that it needs to be a conversation. That's what we're hoping to do at this John Jay Center for Modern Forensic Practice, is to create an academic venue where people can come to the table and talk through these issues. I'm afraid that when you look at the background of the DNA exoneration cases, when you look at the number of field studies that we've done and look at the filler hit rate in the field studies, and then when you consider the number of cases where we won't have DNA as a safety net, you have to remember that the exoneration cases are principally sex crimes where there's someone with an opportunity to observe at close range. You really can't eliminate the possibility that we have to get to work on eyewitness identification in robbery, in drive-by shootings, and the whole range of other cases where we know we're not going to have biological evidence to back us up and to be a check on the process. So having said that, I think the only way forward is for police practitioners and scientists to get together and to work these things through and to create an ongoing conversation which doesn't stop here and wait until somebody categorically disproves it, but where everyone on a regular basis exchanges experience and ideas, where the lab talks to the street and the street talks to the lab, and more importantly, they both listen to each other. And my hope is out of this will come some good new field studies. I think that these laptop studies that a number of departments are considering now, using the protocol that Dr. Malpass and Dr. Stablai collaborated in putting together, is a very good idea for a way forward. And I think, again, we can't ignore the fact that we have a number of steps here where there is a very firm consensus about things that ought to be regularized, and where every department can quickly and with no disruption add, for example, instructions to line up witnesses, choosing better fillers, and move forward on that basis.
Okay, thank you, James. Nancy?
Yeah, I want to echo what James said, and the importance of, and I hope this has happened today, starting a conversation between law enforcement and scientists about how we can move forward together. I hope that law enforcement doesn't kind of stop, put on the brakes, and say, well, we're going to have to wait for more research. I think that would be a mistake, because I think the conversation should be heading forward even as the research is planned and goes on. We want to discuss what might be useful for various jurisdictions in terms of increasing the confidence in their eyewitness evidence. And I think, too, I want to pull this back to the entire issue of memory, the witness's memory. And sometimes I think as I get too bogged down in details and studies and whatever, I need to step back and just say, okay, why is it that we're recommending a sequential procedure? Why is it that we're recommending a blind procedure? And I think the answer that comes to me is, well, is there any reason that a simultaneously presented lineup would help witness memory? Would comparing among photos, does that help a witness's memory? I don't think so. Is there any reason why a non-blind administrator would help a person's memory? Again, it comes back to this issue of how can we possibly get closer to accurate memory of that eyewitness, and those are the kinds of procedures we want to develop in various jurisdictions, however best we can.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Roy?
Well, I think that on the other hand, there's very little evidence to suggest that the sequential lineup helps a person's memory. I mean, it may help their decision process about whether to make an identification at this point or not, but that cuts two ways. If there's more choosing in sequential lineups, then you get more choices of the suspect, and if you get less choosing, you get less choosing of the suspect. You get also less choosing of the and then whether that's a good thing or a bad thing depends on how likely it is, or in a particular case, whether the suspect is actually the offender or not. So how do you assess the utility of these two procedures? Well, it could depend, for example, on whether a particular department is using identification early in a case where they are clearing suspects and have therefore less extrinsic evidence about the actual or the probable guilt or innocence of the person, or whether they're using eyewitness identification late in a case where they already have a lot of extrinsic information about the probable guilt of the person. So it's a tricky call, and I really think that we need more work done. We need to investigate some of the questions in the laboratory about some of the factors that have not been investigated yet, so that we have a stable literature that people agree is looking at the right factors and looking at the whole range instead of just a small range of factors that were convenient to the people doing the research and advocating the technique. But I think I want to go back to Jim Doyle's point. This is the time for academics and for law enforcement to come together, have a dialogue, use each other's resources, and to move on with a program of research. I mean, if at this point in time you can't tell what's better, it doesn't mean that there's that nothing is better. I think that what we need to do is to ask the question in a lot of places, in a lot of different ways, about what techniques are superior. And if we do that for a period of time and have some collaboration, we will find answers.
And just to wrap it up from my end, I just want to add that I think one of the things that we can't forget is the victim. In my experience, I know many times the victims are very reluctant to even look at lineups because of fear of reprisal from the suspect that committed, or the offender that committed the crime against them, and that rapport with the detective is so important to assure that victim that no harm is going to come to them. And it's the reason that police departments started using one-way glass many years ago to assure the victim or the witness that they can't be seen by the offender. And this is especially true in cases involving senior citizens, children, or sexual assault victims. But again, I think that this is a great for us to get together and talk this, and I think we all agree. We all want the right thing here. We want the right person picked and not the innocent person picked. But I want to thank everybody for participating this afternoon. I think it was very beneficial. Dr. Malpass and Dr. Stebley and James Doyle, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is Jim Cooney from the Government Innovators Network. I'll just add a quick thank you as well on behalf of the National Institute of Justice and the Government Innovators Network to all of our panelists and to Superintendent Klein for moderating. And just a note again to our audience that the recording of this event will be made available on our website within the next 2 days, as well as some or all of the presenters' slides from today. And you can get to those by going to the web address www.innovations.harvard.edu. Thanks again, everybody.
You're welcome.
Bye now.
Bye.
Hi, Jim, are you still there?
Yes, Nancy, I am.
Oh, okay. I